Record. Hello and welcome to the Momentum Melon podcast. In this episode, we'll cover Dr. Courtney Weber. Care to introduce yourself?
I guess it's afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Courtney Weber. I am the berry breeder at Cornell University, and I've been directing the program here since 1999. I'm in the College of Agriculture and Life Science in the School of Integrative Plant Science, focusing on horticulture in that section.
Excellent. So let's get started with the first question. You've been doing a lot of work on raspberry breeding. So what are the main goals of your raspberry breeding program, and what parents are you using for said program?
Well, the goals are many and varied. We have multiple tiers of goals, I guess. So the first tier goals are things like fruit quality. Of course, that is the product that you're selling. So everybody, the best plant in the world, if it doesn't have fruit that people want to eat, then it really is not helping us out. So certainly fruit size is important, both from an aesthetic point of view, from the harvest efficiency, and for the consumers, they prefer a larger fruit. We want a color that is bright and stays bright in storage, a bright red generally. We need to breed it for a color that is suitable under fluorescent lighting that you see in most supermarkets. And so that is a color, and we want one that's stable in storage, in cold storage. And so a lot of the germplasm will darken as it stores, and that is a signal to consumers that fruit is overripe. And so we are looking for fruit that doesn't darken, that stays that fresh color longer in storage. And with that storage comes some firmness. And of course, so you have to have firmness so it'll stay in storage for several days, many days at least. You need 7 to 10 days worth of shelf life, and 2 weeks would be better. And of course, then it has to taste good. So we're looking for high sugar levels, high Brix, lower acidity, and it gives it a nice sweet flavor. And then there's a lot of plant characteristics as well. Of course, we need a strong growing plant that is resistant to several diseases. Root rot caused by a Phytophthora is high on the list. For most of our eastern growers that are perennial, eastern United States and Canada, a lot of perennial production. They'll be in the ground for a long time. And so you want them to be able to withstand root diseases such as Phytophthora root rot. There could be problems with crown gall. So we want resistance to crown gall. And then some leaf diseases such as powdery mildew, which can also get on the fruit, especially as we do a lot more production under protected culture tunnels and greenhouse. Powdery mildew can be much more of a problem. And there's some rust and leaf spot diseases as well that we like to see resistance for. And then we want a plant that is upright, strong canes, carries a lot of fruit. We want a large fruiting panicle with many berries. And so that package is not always present in any variety. So we're trying to combine different varieties. We're certainly using our proprietary material that we've been breeding with for many decades here at Cornell. And we, of course, use commercial varieties from the industry to mix in new germplasm and new trait combinations and try to make better trait combinations. So certainly varieties from around the US, some from Europe as they come in. Not as much material gets into the program or into the United States and Canada from Europe, but some of that new material as well. So as far as specific varieties, we've used most of the commercial varieties that you've seen at some point in the last 2 or 3 generations, and we've mixed those with our material that we've been using to try to move things along in the right direction. That's in the red raspberry. We do work in black raspberry as well. So there are 2 different species of raspberry native to this part of North America. And so we work in black raspberry and hybrids between black and red, which are the purple raspberries, trying to transfer some of the traits from red raspberry into black raspberry, such as primocane fruiting or fall fruiting, resistance to powdery mildew, other traits, higher yields, larger fruit, things like that, that are more common in red raspberry or more prominent than in black raspberry. We're using the hybrids as a bridge between the two species.
Oh yeah, I've got another question regarding black raspberry actually. I got a little wild black raspberry of unknown pedigree growing in my backyard. I think it was a random seedling that was dropped there. It seems to have more rust resistance than the red raspberry growing in my backyard. So I'm wondering if the black raspberry naturally has more rust resistance and can be used for breeding purposes in that sense.
So black raspberry grows native throughout eastern North America, from about Kentucky in the United States up into certainly Ontario, Quebec, and eastern provinces in Canada, and then west, certainly through Ontario and through some of the Midwestern states in the US. So it grows in a lot of backyards, right? And a lot of forest edges and ditches and things like that. As far as rust goes, there are two different kinds of rust. So in red raspberry, we deal mostly with late leaf rust that can also get on the fruit. In black raspberry, there's a different rust species that is a systemic rust, orange rust that goes actually into the plant itself. And once the plant is infected, it can't be cured. So the two different rusts are not cross-compatible. So we don't see the late leaf rust in the black raspberry, and we don't see the orange rust in red raspberry. So it's possible we could use black raspberry to transfer some orange leaf rust resistance into red raspberry. But already there's resistance to that disease in red raspberry, so it's an easier transfer to do it from varieties that are more resistant within species than to cross between species. So that's what rust, and we see that with a lot of the diseases. We prefer to use resistance that comes from the species that we're working in, because it's an easier transfer, because we don't get fruit color problems. So when you cross a red raspberry and a black raspberry, you get purple colored fruit, and it doesn't really lend itself well to the fresh market, and people aren't really that interested in it. There are a few varieties of purple used mostly for processing on the local scale, but it has not been a large goal in most programs, more just as a bridge between the two species.
On back to the topic of storage a little bit. So you mentioned that you were breeding for stuff that stores well and stuff that maintains its bright color. Do you know what parents are best suited for that sort of thing, and what the genetics of that is?
We don't really know the genetics behind it. They are complex traits. So red is an interesting, for instance, as a color. So there are simple genetics for red. So there are yellow varieties, and then there are amber varieties. So there's a 2-gene combination that will give you yellow if it's recessive at both loci. But if it is recessive at one and heterozygous at the other, it will give you amber or blushed. And then if you have a red allele at that locus, everything's red. But of course, just like red paint, you go to the paint store, there's 1,000 shades of red. And it's the same in raspberry. There are a lot of different colors of red. And the acceptable range in the supermarket is fairly broad, but often is the lighter side of red, and is also non-darkening, which is a different set of genes, a different set of traits. And so some varieties, when you put them in the cooler, maintain their color better than others. And that is a whole different process as far as the ripening process. And then with firmness, it's the same. You run into the same thing. So we have varieties that are very, very firm, but they tend, you can be too firm with raspberry as far as eating them. People don't like the things that become dry as far as firmness goes. And of course, and eating quality is a very important part of that. So firm varieties that like Joan J is very firm and meaty type of fruit, and that is a nice texture for storage. Unfortunately, that variety tends to be on the darker side as far as red goes. Some of the newer varieties have very good firmness. Nantahala coming out of North Carolina can be firm, and it has a nice light color, but it's susceptible to powdery mildew. And so we have to mix and match the different varieties to try to get some of these things. Titan was a variety we've used. It was developed in our program in the 80s. Firm berry, very large, nice lighter red. It holds its color well, but the flavor is not very good. And so then you work with that, but then you have to work with varieties that have better flavor, try to get that combination of size and firmness with better flavor. And so we have sources of firmness that necessarily have, they have other traits that we don't want, and that's kind of the mix. The color, there's certainly the California material coming out of the Driscoll's program or the plant sciences. Of course, we're not using those varieties in breeding because we don't have access to the varieties, but that's the kind of color that we're looking for. And so we're trying to kind of mimic what they're doing. Some of the stuff out of Oregon has some very nice color, very light reds. Things like there's a series of varieties that came out of the USDA in Oregon that was, they're named after salmon species. I forget all the names. I think there's, anyway, that's something that those varieties and the varieties out of British Columbia, some of those have some nice colors. Often the color of the varieties out of the Pacific Northwest, though, British Columbia and Washington State especially, are more for processing, and those tend to be darker, so we don't use those much in the breeding program. Things like Meeker and Chimenez and others that have been used for processing. So it really is a mix of what you want to do with the plant, whether you want it for processing or whether you want it for fresh. They don't cross over very well. Certainly that you can eat anything fresh, but as far as storage and color, some of the European material, it's got very nice color to it. The varieties coming out of the Netherlands, Coeli, Lanza, there's a few others, that have some nice bright red color to them. So we're seeing it evolve as we go, as the industry moves forward.
All right. So when you crossbreed red raspberry with black raspberry to try to get black raspberries with Primocane fruiting, the genetics of the Primocane trait, what is it like, and how easy is it to transfer over?
So the Primocane trait is an interesting trait. It's fairly strong. It's not single gene. When you make the F1 between a Primocane variety and a Floricane variety, even in red raspberry, pretty much all the offspring are Primocane fruiting to some degree. And Primocane fruiting is like a lot of other traits in raspberry, that it's not an absolute. It is kind of an absolute. You can classify things as Primocane or not Primocane by whether they develop fruit in the fall on the first year's growth, right? But some of them produce 10 fruit at the very tip of the plant, and some of them produce many branches and thousands of fruit. And so if you're going with the absolute, they're both Primocane fruiting, but one is a commercial. What you want for commercial, you need a lot of fruit that the plant branches a lot, and you get a long season, or others that are very late, you just get a little bit on the tip. It's much like that in black raspberry. When you make the cross between red raspberry that is Primocane and a black raspberry that is Floricane, the F1 is generally Primocane fruiting, but it varies quite a bit on the strength. And then as you breed into the black raspberry material that doesn't really have Primocane fruiting in it, you lose some of that strength. And so we're doing some combination in the intermediate material, trying to concentrate some of the genes for Primocane fruiting, so that when we move it back into black raspberry, we get more of that genetic material. Now, there is a little bit of black raspberry Primocane fruiting material out there. There's one variety on the market. It's called Niwot. It was developed from wild material discovered in New York by a private breeder who was a hobbyist, did it in his backyard. The variety's it's interesting. It has very nice floricane fruit. It's not on the super large side, but similar to what Bristol would put out. Very, very good eating quality. Very typical of a wild type plant, very, very vigorous. But it is more upright than most of the wild types. So he did do some, this is Pete Tallman, did some very good work with this variety in starting that Primocane, down that Primocane path for black raspberry. And we have used that one in breeding as well, and crossing that with Primocane red raspberry and Primocane purple raspberries to try to strengthen the trait in the black material. Unfortunately, that variety carries some deleterious traits. It tends to produce double fruit, especially on the Primocane fruit when the flowers are developing during the hot time of the year. So it starts to flower on the Primocane fruit in July and August, and that's the hottest time of the year here in New York. And so we can see a lot of problems with double fruit. Later in the fall, as it starts to get humid and we get cooler but still warm and humid weather, especially under high tunnels, it's very susceptible to powdery mildew, and it will get powdery mildew on the fruit as well. So for the open field, that's not as much of a problem, because the powdery mildew that affects raspberry is susceptible to rain, if that makes any sense. So it likes humid and moist, but it doesn't like free water. So when the spores of this powdery mildew are washed or are exposed or rained on, the spores tend to soak up too much water and they explode. And so that does wash the disease off. But when the leaves are protected and the fruit is protected under a high tunnel and you get high humidity, you get a lot of powdery mildew. So this plant Niwot has problems with powdery mildew under a high tunnel. And so we've been using it in breeding, but we want to be cautious to not transfer too many of the bad traits as well. And it doesn't particularly have large fruit. So we need larger fruit in black raspberry to make it a more mainstream commercial, to try to get it into the fresh market on a larger scale. So our goal is to have black raspberry similar size to what we're seeing in red raspberry, and that will take 100% increase in fruit size essentially in order to get to that same level of fruit size. We also need higher yield in black raspberry so that we can at least be within the range of red raspberry, and that will need probably another 50% increase in yield in order to be competitive. There generally is a price premium for black raspberries because people do desire it, but it doesn't make up for the lower yields at this point in most cases.
Thank you. And one of your papers on Phytophthora, you mentioned that raspberry genetic resistance to Phytophthora root rot is additive dominant in nature, mostly. Can you explain what that means to the audience and explain what the remainder of the genetic resistance in Phytophthora resistance consists of?
So there are multiple Phytophthora species that can affect raspberry, but the most prominent one in our region and in cooler production areas is Phytophthora rubi. Sometimes it's called Phytophthora fragarii variety rubi, depending on the paper and the classification. But this particular disease, so Phytophthora is a fungal-like organism. It's actually what's classified as a water mold. So it's not really a fungus. It's got interesting properties because it has a spore that has a flagella, so it can swim. And so in that case, it's very much like a single-celled animal or single-celled organism that is closer to an animal species, right? So it's got this, but then once it once it infects a plant, it produces mycelium and it grows within the plant itself and will cause disease. And so it's got characteristics of both plants and animals. This spore, not only does it swim, it can detect raspberry roots in the free water within the soil matrix. So if it requires free water to be able to swim, and it can detect some of the chemicals that come off of the root system and swim towards raspberry roots. This is called chemotaxis. And so it can actually swim towards the roots to infect raspberry. This particular species of Phytophthora doesn't affect anything but red raspberry. So it's a very specific pathogen of red raspberry. And what is been found is that it is a species that does not have a sexual reproduction phase. So it is only reproducing through clonal propagation. So it makes spores, but those spores are identical to the plant that, or the fungus-like organism that it came from. And so what that means from a resistance standpoint is that we don't see a lot of change in the disease, which is nice from a breeding standpoint, because once you have resistance, it tends to be very durable. For example, though, in a case where you do see a lot of sexual reproduction in the Phytophthora species is something like late blight in tomatoes and potato. Because there is a sexual phase that you get genetic recombination every generation, you see strains come out all the time that break the resistance of the plant and become resistant to the fungicides or the pesticides that are used to control them. And so late blight that caused the potato famine in Ireland was in the 1800s was caused by that disease. We see late blight and early blight in two different phytophthors in tomato. In many wet years, it becomes a real problem. And these are constantly evolving new strains that can overcome resistance to the resistance in the plants and as well as to the pesticides. In raspberries, we don't see that with this particular Phytophthora because it doesn't have that recombination phase. And so we have durable resistance. And so there's a variety called Latham that's been around for many decades. I think it came out of Minnesota originally, I think in the 1940s, but it's longer than that because it's over 100 years old, that particular variety. And that resistance has held up for that whole time, which is very unusual for a Phytophthora resistance. And so we did a series of crosses with a very susceptible variety, which was Titan, which is a variety that came out of our program in the 80s. And by doing different crosses, looking at the F1 generation, the F2 generation, which is the self-pollination, an F1 is when you cross two parents, the offspring you get would be considered the F1 population. It's not exactly true when you're looking at heterozygous species like raspberry, but that's the most accurate portrayal we have. And then when you self-pollinate that F1, you can get an F2 population, and those will segregate. The traits will segregate across that, just like in any other family. When you have offspring, the offspring are similar to each other, but they're not identical. And so we can separate them out in different classes by exposing them to the disease, which is what we did. And so we also, at the F1 stage, crossed the F1 back to each of the parents and looked at those offspring to see how they segregated. And by taking all the segregation data from each generation, the F1, the back crosses, and the F2, there are genetic formulas and that you can use to look at and do predictions on the number of genes that are involved. And what we found, and then we did molecular mapping as well. We created DNA markers and throughout the genome so that we could track the inheritance of various sections of the genome of each chromosome. And by doing that, we isolated regions that are associated with resistance, regions of the plant's genome that are associated with resistance. So we found two regions that were strongly associated with resistance. And then by looking at segregation data, from the various populations, we determined that those genes were dominant in the fact that when they were present in a single copy or a double copy, that they would express themselves. So when something is recessive, it has to be there. There has to be two alleles for that. So for instance, yellow fruit, you have to have two yellow alleles, otherwise you won't get yellow fruit, you'll get red fruit, or you'll get amber fruit. But we've determined that you had to have a dominant allele at both locations in order for this resistance to show up in the plant. And that does explain some of the durable resistance, because overcoming one gene from a chance evolutionary standpoint from recombination is just more likely to happen than to overcome two genes at the same time. And so because you would have to have two mutations in the pathogen to overcome both genes versus one mutation to overcome just one gene. And so it's just kind of a math problem there when you run into it at that stage. Once you have segregation data, you have some other clues, and then you can make some predictions based on some genetic formulas. I know it can be complicated to understand. And there are other genes involved as well. So those two are like the major genes. And then there are other genes that affect them that may not necessarily be resistance genes. They could be root vigor genes. So because it is a root disease, a stronger root system is able to tolerate more pathogen than a weaker root system. And so just by growing stronger, it could look like it's resistant, where it might just be outgrowing the disease. And so it's kind of a different kind of resistance, or more like a tolerance for the disease, versus susceptibility. When a plant is susceptible, you get a very rapid decline. The plant really, the pathogen infects very easily and propagates itself within the tissues of the plant, and will move up through the root system and into the crown of the plant and kill it, and can do so very, very quickly, within weeks. In experimental conditions anyway. So the difference between susceptible and not susceptible is pretty distinct. But then within that resistant class, you have things that are very resistant, like Latham and other related varieties. And then you have things that are tolerant. Heritage is a variety that's very tolerant. It does have the resistance genes, but it is not as resistant as Latham, for instance. And so there's modifying genes within there as well. And there's a large environmental component as well. And so without wet soils, Phytophthora generally doesn't occur. And so that we really recommend well-drained soils, because that in itself is a way to help mitigate the disease. Even Latham doesn't like to grow in wet soils. Even though it's resistant to the disease, it is still detrimental to the plant. And so there's a lot of things that are involved besides just those two genes. But without those genes, susceptibility is pretty stark, and it is a fatal disease when the plant gets it.
Thank you, and that's pretty much all the questions. So any last words you want to give to the audience?
Well, a little bit about the plant breeding process, I guess. So we've been here at this, we're at the New York State Agricultural Experiment Station, we are Cornell Agritech here. This station has multiple units, including Cornell Agritech, the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has 2 units there as well, and the New York State IPM program are all combined at the New York State Agricultural Experiment Station. And we've been doing work here. This station was authorized by an act of the New York legislature in 1880. We opened in 1882, and have been doing plant breeding here since that time, including berry breeding. The first raspberry variety was released here in, I think, 1904. So we've been at it for a long time. It ebbs and flows on what types of things that we're working on. In the 1920s and 30s, there was a lot of work in black raspberries. And then once we got into the 50s and 60s, there was a lot more work on Primocane fruiting. and heritage was really that first variety of Primocane fruiting that was a commercially viable Primocane variety that could be used to get a real commercial crop. And that really changed the industry, and that is the basis for the modern commercial fresh market, is the Primocane type. And that all started here in the 1960s. We have seen a resurgence recently in Floricane varieties as people are looking to do long cane production, which would be done with Floricane varieties that are overwintered and then forced either in a greenhouse or in a high tunnel in potted culture, but also to avoid some of the spotted wing Drosophila problems. So this fruit fly emerged here a few years ago. It's an invasive species to North America, and it really likes raspberries. And so if we can do Floricane varieties that ripen in late June and early July in our area, that is before the populations of spotted wing Drosophila get very high, and so people can avoid it more than having to spray for it. But we have been working more on Floricane varieties lately. We haven't released any because the industry has gone to Primocane fruiting on the larger scale, and so we've been doing a lot of that, but there is still an interest in Floricane. So we're kind of doing a little bit of both now, while working on Black Raspberry as well. It's one of my favorite berries, Black Raspberry, and so I've kind of reinvigorated that program once I took over in the late 90s, early 2000s, and we hope to bring out some new Black Raspberry varieties in the near future that are spine-free and Primocane fruiting and have better fruit quality than what's been on the market. There hasn't been a lot of work in Black Raspberries around the world, and so there aren't too many new varieties available to growers, and we hope to change that in the coming years. It's fun, I have to say, growing berries and breeding berries. It can be very rewarding. I get to eat berries a lot. I start eating berries in June with my strawberries, and I don't stop until snow flies in the fall. So we're still picking raspberries here in New York under high tunnels, and still enjoying the season. And lately too, we've started working on blackberries, also for Primocane fruiting, and that has become a part of the program. We're really interested in being able to have a consistent Primocane crop here in New York and in other northern climates, so that we can expand that blackberry availability to our consumers as well.
Thank you for the interview. I may pop back with you again to do some more talks on blackberry in the future.
Absolutely. I'm happy to do this. It's interesting, and I'm always, I always like talking about berries and breeding, so it's really not much of a hardship for me to do this. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.